Sergeant Emma Parker boards a plane, exhausted from her overseas service, only to encounter a man who believes she doesn't belong in first class because she's a soldier. A tense exchange follows, with prejudice and bitterness in the air. But when Emma hands the man a heartfelt note, everything changes. The note makes him reflect on his pain and loss, leading to an unexpected moment of mutual understanding and healing between them. Through empathy and a simple gesture, what begins with conflict ends in respect and compassion, showing the power of kindness to bridge divides. If you are not subscribed, I recommend you subscribe and activate the bell so you don't miss any videos. Before we dive into this story, please let me know in the comments where you're watching from. As Sergeant Emma Parker trudged through the bustling halls of Hartsfield-Jackson Airport, exhaustion clung to her like a second skin. The duffel bag slung over her shoulder felt heavier than ever, not just with her belongings, but with the emotional weight of the months spent serving overseas. Each step she took was a reminder of the long days in a foreign land, the sleepless nights, and the constant strain that had worn her down, both physically and mentally. Her once vibrant green uniform was now faded, creased, and a silent testament to her time in the field. Passengers around her bustled by, oblivious to the burden she carried, both seen and unseen. All she longed for now was to collapse into her bed back home, to let the fatigue that clung to her bones finally melt away. As she reached her gate, her eyes fell on the boarding pass in her hand. Her brows furrowed in confusion as she stared at the seat assignment 2 billion first class. It seemed out of place, almost like a mistake. She wasn't used to such luxuries. But with a shrug, Emma made her way onto the plane, her heart heavy but her step steady. As she stepped across the threshold, the flight attendant's eyes immediately flicked to Emma's uniform, and her expression softened into a warm, appreciative smile. "Welcome aboard," Sergeant Parker, the attendant said, her voice filled with genuine gratitude. "Thank you for your service." For a brief moment, Emma felt the tiniest flicker of comfort. It was rare that anyone acknowledged the sacrifices she and her fellow soldiers made. She offered a faint, weary smile before moving forward into the opulent first-class cabin. The sight of the plush, oversized seats made her hesitate. She wasn't accustomed to such luxury, and it felt foreign to be surrounded by passengers who wore expensive suits, carried designer bags, and whose biggest concern seemed to be the temperature of their champagne. Still, Emma reminded herself that she had earned this moment of comfort, no matter how brief it might be. As she sank into the soft leather of her seat, she exhaled deeply, letting the tension that had built up over the months slowly unravel. Just as she closed her eyes, trying to savor the rare moment of peace, a sharp voice cut through the air like a blade. "Excuse me," the tone was dripping with indignation. Emma opened her eyes to see a man standing in the aisle beside her. He was tall, his silver hair slicked back in a manner that screamed self-importance. His tailored suit and polished shoes gleamed, and the disdain in his expression was palpable. He looked down at her, as though she were an intruder in his world of privilege. "I think you're mistaken," he continued, his voice full of barely contained contempt. "This is first class." If you're still tuned into this video and find the story inspiring, drop a 1 in the comments to let me know you're still with me. His eyes flicked over her uniform as if it were a joke, as though someone like her didn't belong in a place like this. Emma could feel the eyes of other passengers watching the confrontation unfold. There was an air of discomfort, a tension that simmered just beneath the surface. For a moment, Emma said nothing. She could feel the weight of his judgment pressing down on her, and it was a feeling she had known all too well. But instead of anger, a quiet resolve settled over her. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small note. With a calmness that betrayed the storm brewing inside her, she handed it to the man. He snatched it from her hand, his annoyance still evident. But as he unfolded the piece of paper and read its contents, his expression changed. The arrogance drained from his face, replaced by something much harder to read: shock, maybe even shame. His mouth moved as if he wanted to say something, but no words came out. The note simply read, "This seat was paid for by the airline in recognition of my service to this country." At that moment, the man was left speechless, his earlier arrogance crumbling in the face of her quiet dignity. Emma turned her gaze back to the window, the world outside passing by in a blur, just like the countless days she had spent serving in silence, expecting nothing but carrying everything. Emma glanced up at the man, momentarily thrown off by his sharp tone. "I don't think so," she responded quietly, holding up her boarding pass. "This is seat 2 billion, and it's mine." The man leaned in closer, his eyes narrowing in disbelief as he scanned her past before flicking his gaze back to her with a sneer. "This has to be some sort of mistake," he muttered under his breath, his words laced with arrogance. "You're military, you belong in coach, not here." His words struck Emma like a blow to the chest. She had encountered prejudice before, whether from ignorance or outright disdain, but it never ceased to sting. Her stomach churned, and a wave of heat rose to her face, but she forced herself to stay composed. She had dealt with worse, much worse, but somehow, it was always these moments of casual cruelty that cut the deepest. "I'm sorry, sir," she managed, her voice steady despite the turmoil swirling inside her, "but this is the seat that was assigned to me." The man scoffed, shaking his head in disbelief, as though the very notion was preposterous. "Unbelievable," he muttered loudly enough for others to hear, his condescension thick in the air. He scanned the cabin, looking for validation from the other passengers, as if expecting them to share in his outrage. "You don't belong here." For a fleeting moment, Emma considered offering to switch seats, anything to diffuse the situation and avoid this uncomfortable public confrontation. She could feel the weight of the passengers' gazes, some curious, others indifferent or judgmental. The tension hung thick in the air, suffocating her. Every fiber of her being urged her to avoid the scene that was quickly unraveling, but she stood her ground, unwilling to shrink under his sense of entitlement. Before she could muster a reply, a flight attendant appeared by the man's side, her expression calm but commanding. "Is there an issue here?" she asked, her voice polite, but with a firm undercurrent that left no room for argument. The man wasted no time launching into his explanation, gesturing animatedly at Emma, his voice rising as if the situation were some gross injustice. But the flight attendant listened patiently, nodding without interruption. When he finally paused, she turned toward Emma with a warm smile. "Sergeant Parker," she said, her tone softening, "your seat is indeed in first class. Thank you for your service." Then, with the same professional composure, she turned to the man. "Sir, your seat is in 4C, just a few rows back. If you need assistance finding it, I'd be happy to help." The man's face flushed a deep red as embarrassment washed over him. He opened his mouth as if to protest further, but no words came out. Realizing there was no victory to be had, he huffed in frustration and turned on his heel, stomping down the aisle to his seat. Emma watched him go, a mixture of relief and frustration swirling inside her. She hadn't asked for this confrontation and hadn't wanted to be the target of his misplaced anger, but here she was, left to navigate the emotional wreckage he had left behind. She sank back into her seat, trying to will away the tension in her body, but the uneasy feeling clung to her like a shadow. As the plane began to fill and the crew prepared for takeoff, Emma stared out the window, desperate to lose herself in the view of the clouds and the shrinking landscape below. But the man's words still echoed in her mind, refusing to let go. All she had wanted was to get home, to leave behind the weight of her deployment, the dangers, the exhaustion, and the constant vigilance. But even at 30,000 feet, soaring above the earth, it seemed she couldn't escape the harsh realities that haunted her. The engines hummed, the plane ascending higher and higher, but Emma's mind was far from the peaceful sky. Instead, it circled back to the scene that had unfolded just moments ago, the sting of the man's contempt lingering in her chest. It wasn't the first time someone had made her feel small for who she was, and it likely wouldn't be the last. Yet, despite the bitterness that welled up inside her, she reminded herself of something important. She had earned her place here. She had survived things most people couldn't imagine. She had given more than many could understand, and though this man's ignorance had momentarily shaken her, it wouldn't define her. As the world below faded into a blur, Emma took a deep breath, pushing the encounter from her mind. She had a long journey ahead, and though it wouldn't be easy, she was determined to face whatever came next with the same strength she had carried with her through every battle before. Emma had weathered countless challenges during her time in the military, endless days in the scorching heat, freezing nights spent without sleep, and the crushing responsibility that came with leading her unit through perilous landscapes. She had faced danger head-on, made decisions that weighed on her soul, and watched friends fall, lives irrevocably shattered in an instant. Time and again, she had drawn on reserves of strength she hadn't even known she possessed, pushing forward because there was no other choice. Through it all, she held fast to one unshakable truth: she was serving something far greater than herself. She was safeguarding freedoms that others, those like the man who had just sneered at her, so easily took for granted. Yet now, Here in the sterile calm of a civilian airplane, thousands of feet in the air, surrounded by comfort and security, she felt a sharp reminder that no matter how much she had sacrificed or how fiercely she had fought, some people would never recognize her worth. The man's sneer, his dismissive, cutting words, they were all too familiar, a bitter echo of the prejudice and dismissal she had encountered so many times before. His actions clawed at memories she wished she could forget, the glances, the whispers, the subtle exclusions. It wasn't just about the seat or the uniform, it was the weight of being judged, not for her courage or her sacrifices, but for how she appeared to him, for fitting into a mold he had crafted in his narrow mind. Her fists clenched involuntarily, the anger bubbling just beneath the surface. She knew she had done nothing wrong. She had earned her place in that first-class seat as much as any other passenger, if not more. But the gall, the sheer audacity of someone so casually dismissing her, trying to diminish her service and her very presence, gnawed at her like a deep, festering wound. She had fought for people like him, for all people, so that they could live in a world free from fear. Yet here was a man standing in his privilege, as if her sacrifices were meaningless to him, as if her existence somehow offended his sense of entitlement. As she sat there, her heart pounding in her chest, Emma realized she couldn't just let this go. She couldn't allow him to walk away unchallenged, to continue believing that his behavior was acceptable, that he could treat people this way without consequence. She had endured far worse than his arrogant sneers, had stood tall in the face of far greater adversaries, and wasn't about to let one man's ignorance diminish her or her service. With resolve hardening inside her, Emma reached into her bag and pulled out a small notepad and pen. The plane dipped slightly as they climbed higher, but her hand remained steady as she began to write, the words pouring out of her in a rush of pent-up emotion. Each stroke of the pen felt cathartic, as if she were releasing the frustration, the hurt, the quiet dignity that had been bottled up for so long. She wrote with clarity and purpose, her heart laid bare on the paper, refusing to let this moment pass without standing her ground. If you're still tuned into this video and find the story inspiring, drop a 2 in the comments to let me know you're still with me. She wasn't writing for his benefit, not entirely. She was writing for herself, to remind herself that she had earned her place not just in this seat, but in this world. She wrote for the soldiers who couldn't speak up, for the ones who were judged for things that had nothing to do with their character or contributions. She wrote because staying silent would be conceding to the very thing she had spent her life fighting against: ignorance, prejudice, and the casual cruelty that so often accompanied them. As the pen moved swiftly across the page, Emma felt a sense of release, of righteous clarity. This was more than just a note to a man who had wronged her. This was a declaration of who she was, a quiet but powerful stand against every person who had ever tried to make her feel small. When she finished, she folded the note carefully and sat back in her seat, her heart still racing but with a newfound sense of peace. Whatever the man chose to do when he read her words was up to him. But Emma knew one thing for certain: she would not let his judgment define her. She had faced down battles far more terrifying than this, and each time she vowed stronger. This was no different. Today was just one more challenge, and like all the others, she would rise above it. I understand that our interaction earlier may have come from a place of misunderstanding, and I wanted to take a moment to address it. I take immense pride in my service to this country, in standing alongside those who have dedicated their lives to protect the freedoms we all hold dear. I've witnessed the heavy cost of those freedoms losses that stay with me every day. I carry with me the memories of friends and comrades who never made it home, and I wear this uniform as a reminder of their sacrifice. I hope that one day we can all look beyond the things that divide us and instead see one another for our shared humanity. In the end, we are far more alike than different, and kindness is a gift we can all afford to give. Sincerely, Sergeant Emma Parker. With a careful fold of the note, Emma felt her heart beat rapidly, caught somewhere between steady resolve and anxious uncertainty. She had no illusions about the man's reaction. There was no guarantee he would read it, let alone understand the message she had written with such sincerity. But it was something she had to do. It wasn't just about standing up for herself, it was for every person who had ever been belittled or marginalized because of another's ignorance or judgment. Emma signaled for the flight attendant, who responded with the same kind smile she had shown earlier. "Could you do me a favor?" Emma asked, extending the small note in her hand. "Would you mind delivering this to the gentleman in 4C?" The attendant glanced at the note before offering a soft nod. "Of course, Sergeant Parker," she replied, her voice laced with warmth and understanding. Emma watched as the attendant made her way down the aisle, her presence calm as she handed the folded paper to Greg Foster. The man looked startled as he accepted it, his brow furrowed in confusion. He hesitated but slowly unfolded the paper, his eyes scanning the handwritten lines. From where Emma sat, she could only catch brief glimpses of his reaction, but she saw the way his body stiffened slightly, the way his shoulders dropped ever so subtly. He read it once, then again, the creases of his frown deepening, his gaze fixed on the paper in his hands. Whatever emotions flickered across his face remained hidden, unreadable from Emma's vantage point. For the remainder of the flight, Greg Foster sat in silence, his gaze repeatedly returning to the note. Emma didn't know what was going through his mind, and she didn't expect an apology or an acknowledgement. It wasn't about that. What mattered was that she had spoken her truth. She had chosen not to stay silent in the face of casual prejudice, and that alone gave her a quiet sense of peace. As the plane finally descended toward Washington Dulles International Airport, the familiar rumble of the landing gear meeting the tarmac jolted Emma from her reflections. The reality of returning home loomed ahead, the anticipation of reuniting with her family growing stronger with each passing moment. The tension of the earlier confrontation seemed to dissolve as thoughts of rest, of finally shedding the weight of deployment, began to fill her mind. She had spent the rest of the flight in quiet contemplation, the incident receding into the background of her thoughts. What lingered wasn't the man's reaction, but the knowledge that, in her way, she had taken a stand against all the small, insidious acts of disrespect that too often went unanswered. As the plane came to a halt, she smiled to herself, knowing that no matter what, she had fought this battle with grace, integrity, and the same courage that had carried her through every challenge before. As the cabin lights flickered on and the familiar rustle of passengers readying to disembark filled the air, Emma unbuckled her seatbelt, gathering her things when she noticed a figure standing nearby. Looking up, she found Greg Foster hovering beside her seat, his demeanor noticeably softer than before. Gone was the rigid arrogance he had displayed earlier. In its place was a man who seemed almost hesitant, uncertain. "Sergeant Parker," he began quietly, his voice carrying an unfamiliar gentleness. Emma stopped, meeting his gaze, waiting to hear what he had to say. "I wanted to thank you for the note," Greg continued, his eyes shifting nervously before locking onto hers. "It made me think." Emma nodded, unsure how to respond. The tension that had once hung between them now seemed to fade, replaced by an unexpected sincerity. She could feel that something had shifted in him, something genuine. Greg drew in a deep breath, as if the next words were heavy and hard to release. "I was out of line earlier," he admitted, his gaze faltering as it dropped to the floor. "I made assumptions about you that weren't fair. They were based on my unresolved issues." Emma remained silent, her eyes softening as he continued. "The truth is," Greg paused, his voice thick with emotion, "I lost my brother in Afghanistan a few years ago. He was a soldier too, and seeing you in that uniform, it brought up feelings I didn't realize I hadn't dealt with. Anger, grief, things I wasn't prepared to face today." A pang of empathy stirred in Emma's chest. She knew the hollow ache of loss, the void that never truly heals. The weight of losing someone in combat was a burden she had seen too many carry. She could see that Greg's pain wasn't about her, it was about something far deeper, something that had haunted him for years. If you're still tuned into this video and find the story inspiring, drop a 3 in the comments to let me know you're still with me. "I'm truly sorry," Greg murmured, his voice barely audible as it wavered. "I took that out on you, and that wasn't right. You didn't deserve that." For a moment they stood there in the middle of the busy aisle, a quiet understanding passing between them. Emma's expression softened as she offered him a small, kind smile. "Thank you," she said, her voice low but filled with warmth. "It takes a lot of courage to admit when we're wrong. I'm sorry for your loss." Greg nodded, his eyes misting over, his grief now laid bare for the first time. "I guess your note helped me realize I've been carrying a lot of anger for too long. I didn't see the person in front of me. I only saw my pain." The silence between them, though brief, felt profound. It was a shared acknowledgement that sometimes the hardest battles aren't fought on the battlefield but within ourselves. Emma understood that all too well. After a moment, Greg reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a small business card. He held it out to her, his hand slightly trembling. "If you ever need anything, don't hesitate to call," he offered, his voice steady but tinged with vulnerability. "And take care of yourself. You're doing something important." Emma accepted the card, glancing at it briefly before slipping it into her bag. She gave him a nod, her smile soft but appreciative. "I will. You take care too, Greg." With that, Greg gave her one last look, a mixture of gratitude and quiet regret before turning to leave. As Emma watched him walk away, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. The confrontation, the bitterness of earlier, had given way to something more meaningful and understanding, however fleeting, that both of them were carrying unseen burdens. And in this brief exchange, maybe they had both found a little bit of healing. As she gathered her things once more and prepared to step off the plane, Emma couldn't help but feel that, despite the unexpected twists of the day, she had walked away from this flight with something far more valuable than she had anticipated, a reminder that even in moments of conflict, connection and understanding were always possible. As Greg disappeared into the flow of passengers leaving the plane, Emma felt a quiet sense of closure wash over her. What had started as a moment of tension and hostility had transformed into an encounter of mutual understanding and respect. It reminded her that even in the most surprising moments, there's always room for growth, for connection, and for recognizing each other as fellow humans, all of us facing our battles, all of us trying to navigate life's grind. Stepping off the plane and into the terminal, Emma felt lighter. The burden that had weighed on her earlier seemed to dissipate, replaced by a quiet optimism. She knew that life would bring more challenges and more conflicts, but this moment had shown her something important: people could change. People like Greg were willing to reflect, grow, and choose kindness over judgment, and that was something worth holding on to. Thank you for watching. I hope today's exploration has offered you valuable insights into your video's specific topic. From the stories shared to the lessons uncovered, there's much to reflect on. What have you learned so far? I'd love to hear from you. Please take a moment to comment below on one thing you've learned and how you plan to bring it into practice in your own life. If you like this video, please leave your comment below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel for more content like this. Your support helps us continue creating and sharing valuable content. Thank you for being part of our community.